Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Aesthetics, the Business of Beauty. Thank you again for joining us. And today we have the special pleasure of welcoming Ericka Adler to our show today. She's a powerhouse in healthcare law with over 25 years in this space. She's passionate about her work and providing exceptional legal guidance to individual providers, physicians, groups, and a myriad of healthcare entities. Ericka expertly navigates the labyrinth of healthcare law, from complex joint ventures and mergers to compliance with state and federal regulations. She's seen and done it all. And not just content with traditional avenues, Ericka keeps her clients and the community informed with her podcast, Roetzel Law Hotspot, and her invaluable contributions to major online platforms like Physicians Practice and Medscape. With a firm commitment to serving the needs of her clients and profession, Ericka is a valuable asset to us all. Welcome to the world of Ericka Adler, where healthcare meets exceptional legal expertise. Hello, Ericka.
Hi.
Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction.
Yes. We're so excited about the program today. You have a lot that you are going to be sharing with us, and we're excited to learn from you. But first, before we get into the questions, could you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. So I'm an attorney, and I have a master's in health law. We work with thousands of physicians in our practice, and we do everything for them. So we're often general counsel to practices. We buy and sell practices. We answer their regulatory issues and their investigation, their license issues, anything a physician or a physician practice needs. Is really what our specialty is. It covers the areas of regulatory and transactional healthcare. We handle their tax issues, their litigation issues, their benefit planning issue. So the life cycle of a practice, from starting it up and even when the doctor retires and goes out of business. And we don't just deal with physicians, but we also deal with other types of healthcare entities and other types of specialties. So we've got lots of other types of licensed professionals that we work with. And there's a great overlap in the knowledge and skill in working with physicians and other types of licensed professionals. And more, we see them doing business together. So it's a nice fit to work with lots of different specialties and the many different kinds of ventures that they go into together. So that's really what we do. And then again, of course, if anybody hasn't done things properly and they get in trouble, we also work with them to kind of get things corrected and deal with, government agencies to help resolve the issues also.
Well, excellent. In other words, you're a good person to have on anybody's side to keep people out of trouble.
We're very, I mean, I've been doing this a really long time, and we really only dedicate ourselves to the provider side. So we're always the one who is representing the provider. We don't represent the hospital side. So anytime there's a professional individual,
Mm.
that specialty will always be on their side. So yeah, it's
All
great.
right. Very cool, very cool. And I also see that besides having your JD degree, you have an LLM degree. Can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, sure. That's my master's of law in health law. So
Mm-hmm.
law school, I knew I was committed to working in health law. And so it kind of gives you a specialty in addressing regulatory healthcare type issues. I spent a lot of time, although it's not part of the med spa world, but we do a lot of work with Stark and anti-kickback and some of those federal regulations that affect physicians who work with payors like that. So we get a lot of expertise in that area, which we, focus on as well, and just understanding the world of healthcare. But I got to tell you, I've been doing this for so long that the world of health, very different world now than it was when I did my degree. So it's continuous education because healthcare changes all the time.
Oh, yes, it definitely does. And there's so between the science that happens in the research labs and the regulatory um, bodies that oversee the practitioners and the whole industry, and also the client, the customers and patients themselves, they have changing needs and desires. So I know in the med spa world, there's a changing attitude. And do you see that is that reflected in the law that you're practicing now? Have you come across any cases where med spas have maybe an increased?
Yeah, I mean, we represent a tremendous number of practices that are a lot of derm aesthetic, plastic surgery type practices, a lot of just med spas on their own, and a lot of other types of practices that are trying to introduce med spa type services into the practice.
Mhm.
Could be gynae or even dentistry, internal medicine. So we're definitely seeing a huge interest in expanding who is offering these types of services. People
Mhm.
are new med spas or new businesses related to their current businesses,
Right.
and certainly a big interest in buyers such as private equity in
Mhm.
acquiring these types of derm aesthetic businesses because I would say 90% of the transactions we do right now are in this area. So
My.
huge interest over the past few years in particular in people acquiring these practices, and I don't see it slowing down. I ask my doctors this all the time, are you being affected by the economy? Are people still coming? People still interested? And they're doing better year over year. They
Yeah.
haven't slowed down. COVID obviously being the exception. So
Right.
really, it's a growth interest. More and more people want to get into it. There's
Mhm.
always new exciting types of technology that's being offered that appeal to different types of specialties as well. So I only see continuous growth in this area.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. I'd like to ask you some more questions on along those lines, but let's start from the very beginning then, I guess. So when a person or a group of people would like to start a med spa, what are some of the caveats that you have for them that you'd
Well,
like to share?
first of all, when somebody wants to start a med spa, I like to know that there's a doctor involved. So, med spas, I think people use that term very generally, but it really does mean something, right? It has to involve some type of services that are somewhat medical in nature. It's not just esthetician services, it's not just massages. It literally has to involve a type of service which the state in which you're residing has indicated needs to be either performed by a physician or somebody else who's licensed appropriately or supervised by that individual. So a med spa is kind of bringing together the aesthetic and cosmetic world along with the medical world. But if you're telling me you want to form a med spa, that to me means that there must be some type of service which somebody has said is somewhat medical in nature. And I'd like to know that there is some type of physician or other licensed individual appropriate for the state, and we can talk about that, who's going to be involved. And so what we then talk about is where are you planning to do this? Because one of the most important things to understand is that for every state in this country, there's different set of rules about who can own an entity, where med spa services are being provided, what services are the type that only a doctor can provide or a doctor can supervise or somebody else can provide or supervise. So the very first question is, what state are you doing this in? Who's involved? And then we can move on to, is this something you can do or not? And a lot of times, there will be just maybe some unlicensed people who want to start a med spa. And we don't say, no, you can't do it, but we'll explain you need to get a doctor or somebody licensed on board. And then we can talk about what the structure needs to be, right? Sometimes the services turn out to be not those that really require a physician because they aren't considered med spa services in that state, right? And sometimes people have misunderstood that the services they're providing don't require a physician to be involved. And that can be fairly disappointing if they've kind of spent a lot of time and effort on their model to have misunderstood, when a physician needs to be involved. So, so very much important to understand who's involved, what state are you in, what services are you offering? And then from there, we can help build out a model that is legal. And to me, this is the most important part of it, because a lot of people very enthusiastically buy into a franchise med spa model or do what their friends are doing or buy something that's on the market through a broker, and they really haven't done their homework. And part of the problem is that if you put a lot of time and money in, you haven't put time and money into getting legal advice, you may find yourself not set up properly. And it can be very expensive to undo and redo. It impacts entities you may have paid to form. It can impact your branding. It can violate state law. So you might have gotten investigated, or you may have violated some other prohibitions, including fee splitting and the corporate medicine, which we can talk about. So really worth it to kind of ask the right questions at the very beginning.
Oh, point well taken. Absolutely. And you're based in Illinois, so but you work with clients all across the country. I understand, correct?
Illinois, and we have lawyers licensed all over, so we work all over. And the laws, to be able to tell you what a particular state allows you to do or not do is the easy part of it, right? It's the structuring that's really the complex part. So,
Okay.
you know what I mean? So it's easy.
Mhm.
Anybody, and by the way, if you're listening to this, you could probably Google your state and what is corporate practice of medicine in this state? What is fee splitting in this state? What are med spa services in this state? What can a esthetician do in this state? So the information is very much available state by state. If you do a little bit of homework, you should be able to kind of narrow it down. And one of the things you want to make sure you're doing is like researching for yourself. A lot of times I find people have taken advice from, at a med spa trade shows, for example, the manufacturer of particular devices, and they may be all around the country. And maybe at one point somebody told them what the law was in one state. And so trade show, they kind of tell people, this is what you're allowed to do. This is who can run the machine for you, right? So it's really actually important to get that information and not rely on other people. Even doctors, who have lawyers, the law constantly. Recently, there's been some changes in a couple of states where the law now only allows physicians to personally supervise and delegate some services, whereas previously other types of lay people were allowed to but to perform services. So now the change in the law has kind of everybody scrambling because that's not how these practices are set up. The physicians make sure people are trained. They may order the service, they may delegate the service, but they're not usually the ones performing it, right?
Right.
And whoever performs it, maybe it is going to be an MA or a lay person. It's not usually an RN in many med spas. They're using unlicensed people because it's those are people trained in in these type of services, they're not RN. So
Right.
it can impact your model, even if you're a really successful medical practice offering med spa services. So it's not just, people who are familiar with the practice of medicine or the law. It changes all the time. It's
Huh.
just like you said, things are changing all the time. Every year, there's many states that have updated regulations in this area.
Right. So, does your firm help med spas or medical practices stay up to date with the law? If you've been retained?
Yeah, of course. With our clients, we're always keeping an eye on changes.
Mhm.
On most physicians will hear about it through their medical society. We have some who are really active in particular aesthetic societies. So we do try and keep people updated. Um, I got to tell you, in some states, the lobbyists sometimes slip this by, even the
Oh,
society. So we recently had a situation with a new client that came to us, and we're doing transaction, and there was a change in the law that the private equity buyer told them about, and it had gotten by. Even the medical society didn't know about it. So it was quite interesting to see that happen. So it
oh,
does happen. Obviously, we try and stay on top of that for.
right. Absolutely. Keep your finger on the pulse and help your clients out. Give them prior notice. So, so let's. So you've seen some. Before we go on to the next question, where is it the State Department of Health where that applies to the med spa
So,
law?
I mean, there are different, in every state, it's slightly different. One of the first places you really want to look is the licensing statute
Oh,
for the physician. What is the physician allowed to do? What is the physician allowed to supervise? What is the physician allowed to delegate? In many states, it's in the physician licensing statute. And you'll see similar types of regulation in the RN or APN mid levels, the
mhm.
the MAs, and the esthetician. So their
Oh,
licenses will tell you what you can do. Some states have particular regulations. I'm sitting here in Illinois, so we
mm,
have guidance provided by what we call the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. They
oh,
put out specific guidance on the use of lasers. They put out guidance on delegation of services in med spas. Can't remember the exact title of it offhand, but those are the type of words you would Google to find those kinds of regulations. So it can, in some states, depends on how big the state is, how active its medical society is, but a lot of medical societies have these
mm,
kinds of statutes on their web pages as well. So you can definitely search. It's usually the department that enforces licensure and corporate practice of medicine.
oh, all right. Very good to know. Thank you for that. And your experience, your 25 years of experience in this area is showing. Your breadth of knowledge is amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. Um, so, what are some structures that you see that can address legal issues in the formation or ownership of med spas?
Well, as I mentioned, physicians typically need to be involved. But in some cases, you have physicians who are going to be active participants. So maybe it is a true med spa where the doctor is running the practice and offering cosmetic, aesthetic services there. Okay. In that particular case, we're really looking at a typical medical practice that needs to be formed in accordance with the state laws. Typically, a PLLC. A professional limited liability company, a professional corporation, or something like that. And it's important to note that in those types of arrangements, no matter how valuable their mid levels might be, their estheticians might be, in most states, those entities can only be owned by licensed physicians, right? So there's really no way for other valuable members of the practice to participate as an owner or even take a distribution financially because there are particular laws. The laws that talk to this are fee splitting prohibitions. Many states have these that don't allow physicians to share on a percentage or other basis any practice revenue with somebody who's not also licensed. And I'm
Oh,
very making a general summary of what that law is. And
mhm, sure.
and then there's corporate practice, and some of those fee splitting laws are tied just to referrals. Some aren't. So you need to look at the state. There's also corporate practice of medicine, and generally, what corporate practice of medicine. By the way, there's corporate practice of dentistry, corporate practice of almost every licensed profession, and almost every state has corporate practice of medicine in one form or another. And what this says is that physicians cannot be employed by non-physicians or controlled by non-physicians. Okay, so that makes it very hard for somebody to operate a med spa and just hire a doctor to work there, right? Because you've got a corporate practice of medicine doctrine. So, and again, it varies from state to state, but this is what the majority of states provide for. So what do we do in this case? We can have a true medical practice, and the people who work there are compensated very nicely. But if we want to do some more sophisticated arrangement, or we want to have an arrangement where non-licensed people are really participating in the profitability and success of a med spa, we have to find another way to do that. And one of the most popular ways to do it is through the use of a management service organization, or an MSO. In an MSO arrangement, you still need a clinical entity in most states because that's where the practice of medicine occurs. So you still need a physician on board. And we can talk about that physician's role. You then would have a management agreement with this management service organization. And that management service organization, also called an MSO, is a business entity. It can be owned by whoever wants to own it. That's where you come in with the opportunity to give ownership to valuable members of your team, or even just non-doctors who are really business oriented, want to open or run a med spa. Okay, so that's where they would sit, is in that MSO. The MSO then has a management agreement with the practice, and it promises to provide to the practice in that agreement everything the practice needs to operate, or as much as the parties want to provide. It can be the space, the equipment, the non-licensed personnel, management services, billing services, marketing, whatever you want it to be. Okay, now I'm assuming for purpose of discussion, we're talking cash businesses here. There are some nuances if commercial insurance or federal dollars were involved. So this is cash. So basically, under that management arrangement, the MSO is able to charge for all things that they're providing, and maybe include a little bit of a markup for the services they're bringing. They can also provide the branding name and license it for the practice to use, right? They lots of different things, and they're charging the practice. By charging the practice, they're pulling up all that money out of the practice into the MSO, which is then distributed to the owners of the MSO. Typically, there's an operating agreement among the owners to describe how that would work. So at the clinical level, though, we still need the doctor to practice. That still needs to have malpractice insurance, still needs to be proper. And the most important thing to remember is the MSO cannot overstep its bounds. It cannot interfere with decision-making of a medical or clinical nature. It still needs to leave a lot of the actual true clinical decision-making to the physician. And in many states, that's been interpreted to expand to medications that might be offered, the clinical equipment to be purchased, hiring and firing clinical staff. Okay. Because what the government, of course, is concerned about is non-licensed people interfering with the doctor's practice, and they view some of those decisions as interference, which would again violate the corporate practice of medicine. So it's kind of a slippery slope, and obviously I'm speaking in general and broad strokes here, but that's generally the reasons for setting it up this way. Now, when you have a physician who's truly owning and working in that practice, that's excellent. But in many cases, you have people who just want to do a med spa. They don't really have a doctor that's involved. Okay. And a lot of times I've seen them set it up incorrectly, where they have a business, they set up themselves, and then they hire a doctor to be a medical director. Okay. That incorrect. That does not solve any of the issues that I have talked about here. It will not prevent you from being in trouble for violating corporate practice of medicine, fee splitting, or otherwise. Okay. The only thing that really achieves in some cases is, I think they're trying to make sure that there's somebody there to supervise, because they understand that supervision services are required. However, in most cases where we've gotten involved to correct that kind of situation, they haven't really understood the supervision services at all. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of different things.
Sure.
do have a doctor involved that's truly involved, that's great. But where you don't have it, you still need to somehow have this structure here. So you need to find a doctor. But some
Okay.
doctor only wants to be minimally involved, right?
Is that a friendly physician? I guess is that the terminology?
Exactly. They're willing to supervise, they're willing to look at your policies, they're willing to see the patients themselves that need to be seen. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that there are doctors out there. They want it's a little money that's extra for them on the side,
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes they're willing to do this. So what you need to do is to find a doctor who's willing to own that practice for you. And that's called a friendly physician. Okay.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
I'm on both sides of this, right? So
Yes, you are.
people set up the med spas, but I'm also trying to protect my doctors when they're asked to be those friendly physicians, right? So I think the best solution is when everybody comes to the table trying to protect each other. And what you want is a doctor who's not just letting their license be used, who really is taking somewhat of an active interest and role. You want a doctor who's protected from liability. So, for example, you're using an entity owned by this physician, you're billing for services, but what if the med spa management doesn't pay the vendors? What if they don't pay the employees? Right?
Right.
It's really the med spa that in some cases can be held responsible if they're not paying the nurses, they're not paying whatever. It's the doctor's entity that ends up getting sued, even though the doctor wasn't involved, right? So
Right.
we want to make sure the doctor's indemnified. Also, the clinical entity, when people pay, they're paying the clinical entity, and then the money, remember, is pulled out as a management fee. So what about taxes? That clinical entity is going to have to report taxes. And if you're a successful med spa, that's going to be a lot of taxes. So we doctor responsible for taxes. In most cases, the doctor is receiving a very nominal amount to maybe be the friendly physician and provide some limited supervision and oversight, right? He's
Right.
not
Right.
not the one really making the dollars here, because the dollars are at the MSO level. So
Right.
does that make sense so far?
Oh, yes, it does completely sense. And I want to go back and talk about the MSO. So that there's a legal document you mentioned, and typically an arrangement between them. So can you walk us through again how they're related, the
So
MSO and the? Go ahead.
So the MSO and the practice have a management agreement. And
Okay.
what this agreement is going to describe is typically all the services that the MSO is going to provide. As I mentioned, it could be space, equipment, personnel, billing, marketing, technology, branding, licensing. And then what you need to do is figure out what is the fee for all this.
Right.
So if the MSO is really the landlord giving the space to the spa, then they have to collect enough to pay the rent, right? They've
Right.
got collecting enough to cover all the employment services of the people managing, providing, all the services. They've got to cover the inventory and supplies and the build out costs if you did a build out. So
Sure.
that agreement really just says, here are the services we're providing and here's what you're paying us for them. And
Hmm.
depending on the state you're in, I mentioned fee splitting. Typically, that needs to be a flat fee as opposed to a percentage arrangement, except for billing. Um, the government in many states feel that if you charge a percentage of collections of revenue, that it's an incentive to refer, an incentive to inappropriately generate business. So they want to see a flat fee. So you again run into this problem. Well, hopefully you're growing and growing, so what's the right flat fee, right? um,
Right.
you might need to back into that number and potentially adjust it. That's one of the things that we work into the document, is how we evaluate that, how often we adjust it. Again, there's some state law components to the frequency of adjusting things. Um,
Right.
that's essentially what it says. Another important document, though, is the relationship among the parties, which is the
Hmm.
operating agreement or the shareholders agreement of the people owning that MSO, which could be all, just investors. It
Right.
could be the doctor could be involved at that level. The estheticians and nurses can be involved. And that document is the one that spells out, what happens if you want to leave? How do we divide up profit? What if
Oh,
we sell? How do we make a vote on whether we sell or not? So that document talks about the decisions of the owners.
Right. And it seems like it's a partnership agreement at that level. Right.
Correct. Another.
Okay.
Mhm.
Very interesting and a little bit confusing, but thanks for teasing and sorting it out for us. So the flat fee, can you give us an idea what it typically is? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, every business is going to be completely different. So,
Yeah.
typically what you need to do is work with your accountant or your financial advisor. What you want to do is really, you should have a business plan. I mean, anybody going into a business has a business plan. You know what your costs are going to be to operate this business. Like I said, the space, the non-licensed personnel, you probably have IT issues, you have insurance, you have supplies, you have, marketing, whatever it is you're doing is really important. So you need to kind of budget what that's going to be. And then obviously you're entitled to make a bit of a profit, not exorbitant, because keep in mind that management fee that's getting charged really kind of still should be within the realm of fair market value, right?
Right.
So got to kind of figure out what that's going to be. But the idea is it has to be somewhat high enough because you really don't want to leave profit in that clinical entity, right? Remember, the doctor owns the clinical entity. We really don't want any money left there. So we've got to be making enough, providing enough services or to be able to charge enough to pull all that money out. And sometimes the owners of the MSO are paid for providing certain services, and those get expensed out. But I haven't really had too many med spas where they have trouble coming up with that management fee. There's a lot
Oh,
of work that goes into it, especially the marketing piece.
right.
Really, I mean, I was talking with somebody who was telling me about some of the marketing techniques. You run clubs. Some of these med spas have clubs where you can have membership. I have clients who do gift card parties. They do huge marketing efforts. They spend a lot of time, money. They hire outside vendors to host large parties. I mean, all of that are business that the management company has to pay for. So those, they might run it through as an expense to the clinical practice. So
Right.
lots of expenses. Nobody should have a problem with that.
No, so anything that's outside of the realm of medical practice can be revenue generating for the MSO.
Right. And I
Anything
mean,
that's not directly
exactly.
medical.
And your non-licensed personnel can be
Mhm.
MSO.
Oh,
Okay. Only
right.
clinical licensed people need to be at that level. So that's where you have your physician, you have your MA, you have an RN or a PA, right, an APN. So they're there, and that's where services are getting billed. But those people usually are paid their salaries there, and remember,
Mhm.
the doctor is typically, unless it's a true physician-owned, med spa. Um,
Right.
Doctor's not there every day. So in most med spa models, the doctor is there infrequently or providing supervision or collaboration type services. So,
Sure.
usually their fee is rather small, right? So
Right.
it's not a lot of money that needs to sit in the clinic to be paid to
Right.
people working there.
So that the providers they're paid from the MSO. I might be confused here. The providers are paid by the MSO.
No, so if you have a license,
Mm-hmm.
paid at the clinic level. So if the
Okay.
clinic brings in $50,000, you might have $20,000 in salaries for your RN, your PN, your doctor, and then the remaining amount is used to pay that management fee. At the manager level, you have people who do not have licenses, and there's lots of people working and managing a clinic who are not licensed. So those people are paid by the MSO, right? So it's kind of allocating where the money needs to go. That's why you really need a budget. And so we work with our clients on this part of it, and it's really spelled out very clearly in that management agreement. The clinical piece stays at the clinic, the non-clinical is owned and managed and paid for by the MSO. So very little activity at the clinic level.
Right. So let's jump into the private equity then, because that seems like a nice segue. There, that's where private equity is looking to become involved with medical spas. Is that correct?
Correct. So we see a lot of private equity interests in not just med spas, but medical
Yeah.
practices offer any type of aesthetic or cosmetic services. They're really looking a lot for cash-based practices that are primarily aesthetic in nature, which is just another way of saying a med spa, right?
Yes.
And still some derm and plastic surgery. Those are the biggest ones that are really big in aesthetics right now. So
Mhm.
private equity is super interested. Over the past couple of years, we have handled, I can't even tell you the number of sales in this specialty. Even single owner physician aesthetic type practices are getting tremendous purchase prices.
Right.
And there is competition to buy them. And
Oh, yes.
what they're really looking for, though, is a properly set up and properly
Mhm.
run med spa business. Okay,
Right.
so
So
this,
if a person, if an owner is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
it just leads me to the next question. So we're also going to be discussing the sale of a med spa, and so private equity, in essence, becomes a sales transaction.
exactly. It is exactly a sale transaction. So you have to look at both sides of it. When you're,
Mhm.
what is the buyer looking for? Is the same answer to how do you sell, right?
Mhm.
Because you give them, you have to have reached a certain threshold. Obviously, I think it's something like 1.4 million or so
Mhm.
is a magic number for somebody really to be interested in acquiring a med spa, particularly private equity. They do intense due diligence.
Mhm.
So all these things we've been talking about. Did you form your entity properly? Is your entity that's owned by the doctor, did you form it as a business entity or did you form it as a professional entity? What does that management agreement look like? Is it set up properly? Are you doing things that really cross over into corporate practice of medicine? Are you fee splitting? Right?
Mhm.
They're looking at all this. And very importantly, and this is something I didn't mention, I kind of mentioned, but didn't get into before, the
Mhm.
physician that is part of this transaction plays a really important role because he or she is supervising services, and this
Mhm.
is where a lot of people get really tripped up. There are lots of people who are very capable of performing lots of services offered in a med spa, but that is not the same as the question as to whether they should be performing it based on state law, whether it makes sense to you or not, whether that patient should have had a physician visit before those services started to be performed. And then there's also rules about who a physician can actually delegate to. So your esthetician, your MA, and your PA may all do a great job at a particular service, but the law may say that the physician can only delegate to this person, right? So you really need to know exactly what those laws are. And if you're not following it, in addition to the risk of noncompliance and investigation by the state, you can be sure that when private equity comes along, they're going to immediately discover this and they're either going to not be interested because you weren't running yourself properly. They may want you to correct things. And what I've learned is that correcting things can totally ruin the financial viability of a med spa because a lot of services are delegated often to individuals who are unlicensed, they're lay people, and the doctor is not expecting to be present or not expecting to have to hire an RN or somebody with a higher license to perform those services. So it can really throw off the expenses of the med spa to have to go out and hire different people, right? It
Mhm.
can throw you off in terms of just how you're set up. I worked with a med spa recently that had hired a totally inappropriate person to based on state law to have been performing these services, and in addition to getting investigated, fined, having to shut down while they could locate the right person to actually come in and do the services, the cost to them of that person compared to who had been performing it previously made the med spa fairly unprofitable, right? And it took a long time to rebuild, and they had actually been in discussions to sell. So getting things right, knowing the rules from day one.
Mhm. Right.
Or
Yes. Run a clean shop, right?
exactly,
Compliant shop.
exactly. It's interesting because if you also like estheticians are licensed to do certain things, and
Mhm.
they often are asked to do other things. And when they're doing non-esthetician things, they're doing it as a lay person. But if they're wearing their name tag that says esthetician, then they're doing something outside their license, and that violates the law. So there's really tricky components that you need to be aware of.
Sure. Understood. So staying on top of the laws and being continuously in compliant with them, and having someone like you,
Right. And this is
you know,
so, when we talk
backs.
about private equity, this is so
Yes.
important. If you're building something and hoping that they're going to come and buy you,
Hmm.
this is the easiest thing to get right.
Right.
There's really, I mean, there may be other things they're not doing right, but this part is fairly easy. I mean, we do this all the time. The only reason you wouldn't get this right is you didn't talk to somebody who is familiar with the law, right? When you're looking to sell is, cleaning things up a little bit. Are you in the middle of a lawsuit, right? What does your space look like? What is your marketing? I hear a lot of issues about reviews online, and a buyer certainly doesn't want to see a lot of negative things about how rude people are there, right? So very obvious things like that
Uh-huh.
needs to be cleaned up as well. And then the other things they're looking for really, are you keeping proper medical records? The doctor should be doing visits with patients who first come in. In Illinois, for example, for laser hair removal, the doctor needs to have that first visit. And for every patient, you need a medical record set up. You need to comply with HIPAA, right? So these are
Right.
these are this is the true medical business that you're running when you're doing a med spa, and these things need to be done properly, and all of them are part of the due diligence part of potentially selling, right?
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, not so, I'm trying not to repeat myself here, but these all feed into the exact same issues.
Yes, no risk of repeating. It's just worth hearing again, because to emphasize the importance of what you are saying. Yes, thank you for clarifying all of that for us. Yeah, awesome.
If you're thinking of selling to private equity, another recommendation I would make is that
Mhm.
you should be talking with a financial expert. That wouldn't be me, obviously, but somebody who can look at your books and records and really position you
Mm.
to be able to sell. A lot of private equity, they buy based on your EBITDA. Okay.
Right.
EBITDA
Hmm.
is a measure. I'm sure you've covered this topic before. But basically, they're looking at your revenue and your earnings before taxes, and other factors like that. And the EBITDA is almost like an art rather than a science. There You can add in and remove, et cetera, to kind of play around with that EBITDA. There are
Sure.
ways to slightly change how you run your business to improve your EBITDA. The higher the EBITDA, the more money you end up with if you go to sell, particularly if private equity pays you a multiple of that EBITDA. And
Mm-hmm.
not only is there the purchase price aspect of it, but then a lot of purchase prices are broken down. So you are getting cash when you sell, but then they might also pay you a bonus or some later amount based on maintaining that EBITDA or increasing that EBITDA. So
Hmm.
understanding what your EBITDA is, how you're calculating it, how to get it into the best shape, right? A lot of people run a ton of expenses through their businesses, and med spas are no exception to that, and that can really ruin your EBITDA. So if you're really thinking that one day down the road you want to sell, getting proper financial advice, taking like 6 months, maybe even a year to start positioning yourself properly to be able to sell financially is important as well. Definitely something that you want to plan for. And then, talking with people who do these transactions to understand the pluses and the minuses. So many potential buyers out there. I mentioned this early. A lot of our medical aesthetic practices have multiple offers on the table when they go to sell. They can compare them. Are they looking to keep your staff? Are they terminating them? How much are they offering? What multiple are they offering? Various things like that that you want to think about. And if set yourself up properly, then you can really get multiple offers and compare them to each other and get yourself, the best transaction. Now, obviously, it's not always just about the most money. A lot of people have given their heart and soul to their medical practices and their med spas, and they want to stay involved. A lot of deals require you to stay involved, particularly with private equity. So you also want to make sure that you're partnering with a buyer that you can live with, that has maybe some of the same values as you. And in addition to the purchase price, you kind of also want to make sure that the ongoing compensation for what you're going to be contributing is
Mhm.
acceptable as well. Um,
Mhm.
you know, I know it all, like, as long as I get a good paycheck and I'm set for retirement, worry about it. But a year in, you really do care about that paycheck when you're working very hard. So those,
Yes,
it's not like you have to choose one or the other. You can have both, right? And you need to
that's right.
really kind of talk about that.
Right. And that's assuming that the patient base stays with the
Yeah.
med spa under new ownership.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, to be honest, most of the purchases are so discreet. They're in the background. You wouldn't necessarily know that a transaction has taken place. The doctor or whoever the main people are stay involved. They're the face of it, right? The name usually doesn't change. The location doesn't change. You
Yes.
know that anything has changed at all.
No.
Okay. Um,
Yeah.
what typically will happen if you're already set up, particularly as an MSO arrangement, the MSO that you set up will be replaced by the MSO of the private equity. And they use this same model, clinical practice with a management agreement to an MSO. It's the
Yes.
exact model that we've been talking about. So it is a very tried and true model that
Mhm.
as well. And there's no reason that model, because private equity, they're not licensed doctors, so they can't own the practice either, right? So
Right.
they use the same model that I'm recommending that you don't have to be private equity to use.
Right.
It's very doable if it's done properly.
Oh, excellent. Wow. You're a wealth of information, Erica. Thank you so much, for sharing that with us. Now, we could go back and visit the idea of just, I need some clarification, got a comment. So when after, say a nurse practitioner wants to start a medical spa, what are the steps that she needs to go through?
So a nurse practitioner, depending on the state you're in, may or may not be able to do it on their own. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
A nurse practitioner is kind of a general term. Here in Illinois, that would be an advanced practice nurse, but in other states, they might have other names as well. So here in Illinois, for example, advanced practice nurses can own uh, an entity themselves, a professional entity.
Mm-hmm.
Very much what we were talking about um, without some of the involvement of a doctor. Now, again, and I don't know the answer to this off the top of my head, you still need to go back and take a look at what those particular services are that you're going to offer, um, who has to supervise, who can delegate. So, again, state is completely different. So, you want to look at, can a nurse practitioner own a professional entity independently? If they
Mm-hmm.
can in your state, are they the ones that are allowed to supervise the services and to delegate those services? There are different departments that write these,
Mm-hmm.
so they are not necessarily completely aligned. And that's why my answer is as it is, because you can't
Yes.
assume one because of the other. Okay, so, but yeah, it would be very much the same setup. You could have a nurse practitioner with a management agreement with an MSO, or just
Mhm.
owning it on their own, assuming the state allows it.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Thanks for that. So, what about malpractice lawsuits? So, if, by some fluke, there's a lawsuit that comes on the horizon
Mhm.
against the medical spa for what somebody might consider a botched procedure. How, well, and assuming that the medical spa would have malpractice suit
Right.
insurance in place.
The clinical entity
Yeah.
absolutely needs malpractice. It's a medical practice.
Mhm.
It's medical,
Mhm.
even though we call it a med spa, it should have malpractice. Every state requires medical entity to have malpractice. You want to make sure anybody rendering services there has the appropriate level of coverage. This
Yeah.
is where it's dicey if you have a doctor who's just kind of acting as your friendly physician, right?
Mhm.
They actually could unwittingly get dragged in here. Maybe they saw the patient and then they delegated the service that was being performed by a nurse practitioner or an esthetician. Something happened, right? And it went wrong. You can assume the doctor is automatically going to be involved in that lawsuit, right? So that is yet another reason just to make sure, in addition to having appropriate malpractice coverage, do you have good policies in place? What are the screening practices to determine whether a patient should or should not be having a service? Are you documenting everything? Those visits with a physician or a nurse practitioner before a patient starts receiving services, they're not just an inconvenience, right? Does
Mhm.
have any medication they're on or any other contraindications.
Mhm.
Think very often as aesthetic services as just not being the same as medical services, but in many cases they are, and there can be some consequences, bad reactions, etc. So you also need protocols. There's been unfortunately a lot of situations in the news where doctors or other healthcare workers covered things up sometimes, didn't
Mhm.
quickly, weren't properly trained in even the basics of CPR or other types of services. So malpractice can happen anywhere. You have to assume it could happen in your practice and you should be following guidelines. And luckily, malpractice carriers do a really good job of kind of providing some of that guidance
Mhm.
and they have checklists for things you should be doing. And I think a lot of times when it's more of a casual med spa where it's not a physician, everyday full blown practice, that it's people think of it more as a business and less of a medical practice. And I think we need to kind of change our thinking because it is truly for purposes of the law a medical practice, and
Yes.
responsibility can seep out of that med spa to the manager and
Mhm.
licensed people in the MSO, depending on what the events are that have occurred, how things have been set up, and their involvement, whether it was appropriate or not, the
Mm.
training, etc. So, you're not immune necessarily to malpractice. If you're involved, there's always a risk.
Yes, there is always a risk. Anytime you're dealing with someone personally, there's always a risk.
Exactly.
Thank you for that. Also, so we're coming down to the final minutes of the show, but I do want to ask you what your perspective is on where things are going with medical spas and how they relate to you.
So for me, I mean, I think med spas are just really um, the most exciting, probably part of my practice. I feel like we represent every type of specialty, but for the past couple of years, I've been really involved with medical and aesthetic practices. We have med spas that have expanded into their own skincare lines, and we work with them on that. We have some medical spas that don't just do med spas; a lot of them do clinical research on aesthetic laser use and cosmetic type services like that. So I find it really exciting. Like I mentioned, I've seen incredible interest. It really hasn't slowed down in the past couple of years. My clients report year over year, month over month, their volume of clientele is increasing, their profitability is increasing, the number of people bidding on trying to buy spas and practices continues to grow. I will say, even though there's all that interest, we are seeing a slight decrease in the amounts getting paid for med spas, only because I think the interest rates are a little bit higher. It's more expensive to borrow money. But we're seeing some creative alternatives in terms of partnering with, the med spa owners, you know, in terms of future success of the med spa after it's acquired to kind of make up for that. So I think I see a lot of future growth over the next few years. It's the best area to be in. You're not regulated in the same way that, other types of medicine are without commercial or federal payors involved. There's so much more freedom. It's much more enjoyable for me. And I would guess for many doctors, it is as well.
Oh, wonderful. Are there any other final thoughts that you'd like to leave with us?
Really, just that I think med spas are an exciting place to be. It's not hard to start one. It's not hard to buy one. It's not hard to sell one. But like anything else, there are just some rules that you need to follow. And the consequences of not following the rules can be expensive. And it's not expensive to find out what those rules are and to make sure you're doing it right. I think the benefits greatly outweigh the deficits in terms of getting that advice up front, whether it's financial, legal, or even there's lots of great consultants out there in this arena who will give you some basic advice to get started and guide you towards a good team. In any medical practice, any type of transaction or business, you really just need a good team. And it starts from the day you get the idea of what you want to do. It's your real estate broker, your lawyer, your accountant, etc. You need a good team. This is the medical industry. It's different than any other. And you just need to kind of get your ducks in a row and be ready.
Amazing and awesome. My gosh. So if people have questions, may they contact you?
Absolutely. You can contact me. I think you see my email going across.
Yeah.
You can call me. I'm happy to answer questions. My own podcast is the Health Law Hotspot. And we haven't covered this topic exactly, but we've
Oh,
definitely
yes,
talked.
please discuss it. Thank you. Bring it up.
Yeah, no, I don't know if we've ever covered this topic, but
No,
we
we haven't.
malpractice issues and we talk about licensing issues. And there may be other answers that you find there on things I didn't get a chance to cover. And if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer, and feel free to follow up with me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ericka. And yes, I do recommend that if you're interested at all in anything law related and with the health practice industry, do check out Hotspot. Ericka Adler is the host, and they bring on so many engaging and very relevant topics to discuss for the medical industry. Thank you so much, Ericka. And if in the future we might ask you to come on again, you've got so much to offer, and I would love to have you on again if that opportunity ever arises for
Absolutely.
us again.
Just ask. I'll be here.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So we're going to want to thank Ericka once again for joining us, and I want to invite you to also to continue watching our next our episode next week is going to feature Terry. She's a very, very amazing human being, has been in the MedSpa industry for a long time. Terry Ross is the founder and CEO of Terry Ross Consulting and also the president of Aesthetics. She's going to be talking about knowing your numbers. And the title of her talk is going to be Data is Sexy, How Knowing Your Numbers and the Top KPIs Can 10 Times Your Business and Empower Your Team. I encourage you to check us out next Wednesday, same time, same place. But also, if you have time, I'd like you to check out last week's program. Ignacio Fanlo has another business model for medical spas that is just a year old now, but it's being adopted very quickly. And it's imagining a med spa as a landlord, a med spa owner being landlord for the med spa providers. It's a different kind of model. If you're curious about it, do check out that podcast. All right. So we're coming to the end of the show. Do subscribe to the channel. We'd love to keep in touch with you. And until the next time, stay happy and stay beautiful. Goodbye for now.